The guy actually waved at me while driving across my front lawn. Not an apology, not an embarrassed little gesture because he'd made a mistake. No. He smiled and gave me a casual wave like we were neighbors sharing the same driveway. Then he cut across 20 feet of grass I'd spent years caring for, jumped the curb on the other side, and disappeared into morning traffic. I remember standing there with a coffee mug in my hand thinking the same thing over and over. What kind of person does that? My name is Garrett Nolan, and a couple of years ago, I learned something that sounds obvious until it happens to you. People don't always take what belongs to them. Sometimes they take what belongs to you simply because nobody stops them. My wife Allison and I lived on the edge of a small town called Fairview Crossing, about 40 minutes outside Wichita. It wasn't some wealthy neighborhood. No gated entrances. No country club. Just a quiet community where people knew each other's dogs better than each other's names. Our house sat on a corner lot where Oak Ridge Drive met a busy 4-lane road that carried commuters into the city every morning. When we bought the place, the corner was one of my favorite parts of the property. There was a broad stretch of lawn wrapping around the intersection, almost like a small green peninsula between the roads. Kids played catch there, families walked by in the evenings, and during spring the grass looked so healthy it almost glowed after rainstorms. I know some people don't understand lawn guys. I get it. Grass isn't exactly exciting, but every homeowner has something they take pride in. For some people it's a garage. For others it's a workshop or a garden. For me it was that lawn. I planted it, maintained it, spent weekends working on it, and after long weeks at work, there was something satisfying about sitting on the porch and seeing a property that reflected years of effort. Then one morning I noticed tire marks. Nothing dramatic, just 2 curved tracks cutting through the corner. I figured somebody got lost. Maybe they missed a turn. Maybe they were avoiding an accident. Whatever happened, it didn't seem important. A few days later I saw another set. Then another. Then another. The strange thing wasn't the tracks. It was how identical they were. Every single one followed the exact same path. One Saturday morning I was trimming shrubs near the driveway when I finally saw it happen. A silver sedan approached the intersection, slowed down slightly. Then instead of waiting behind traffic, the driver casually steered onto my lawn. Right onto it. No hesitation. No uncertainty. He rolled across the grass, skipped half the line of waiting vehicles, merged back onto the road, and continued on his way. I actually looked around to make sure I'd seen it correctly. It felt so absurd my brain struggled to process it. A few minutes later Allison came outside carrying a glass of lemonade. "You look confused. I think someone just drove through our yard." She laughed. "What?" Before I could answer, another vehicle did the exact same thing. This time we both watched. The SUV crossed the lawn, bypassed traffic, and merged back onto the road. Allison lowered her glass. "Okay, that's a problem." Unfortunately, it wasn't just a problem. It was the beginning of a pattern. Over the next several weeks, more drivers started using the shortcut. At first it was 1 or 2, then 5, then 10. Apparently someone had discovered that cutting through my property allowed them to bypass part of the backup at the traffic light. And once a few people started doing it, others followed. Human beings are funny that way. Show someone a shortcut and suddenly they stop asking whether they should take it. They only ask whether it works. By early summer the corner of my lawn was changing. The grass flattened. The soil hardened. The green color started disappearing. Every morning fresh tire marks appeared. Every afternoon, I found new damage. The corner no longer looked like part of a yard. It looked like the beginning of a dirt road. What bothered me wasn't just the physical damage. It was the complete lack of shame. One morning I was standing by the mailbox when a black pickup crossed the lawn less than 20 feet away. I raised both arms. The driver looked directly at me, then shrugged. Actually shrugged. Like I was the unreasonable one. Like somehow I was inconveniencing him by owning property that happened to be located near his preferred route. That moment stayed with me because it revealed the truth. These people weren't confused. They weren't lost. They weren't making mistakes. They knew exactly what they were doing. And they didn't care. I tried being reasonable first. I bought decorative landscaping stones and lined the edge of the corner. Within days, several had been pushed aside. Then I installed wooden marker posts. Someone snapped them. Then I put up signs. Big signs. Private property. Keep off grass. No vehicle access. The signs might as well have been invisible. One morning, I watched a minivan drive directly between 2 of them. The driver never even slowed down. That was the day I stopped believing the issue was awareness. The issue was consequence. People saw the signs. They saw the grass. They saw the house. They saw me. None of it mattered because nothing happened when they ignored it. A week later, my neighbor Russell stopped by while I was inspecting another set of tire tracks. He looked at the dirt path cutting through the corner and shook his head. You know what the real problem is? What? They don't think it's your lawn anymore. I remember staring at him because the second he said it, I knew he was right. The shortcut had existed long enough that drivers had mentally claimed it. In their minds, it wasn't Garrett's property. It wasn't private land. It was simply part of their commute. And once people convince themselves they're entitled to something, asking nicely rarely changes their minds. The next morning I sat by the front window with a notebook and a cup of coffee. I wanted proof. For 30 minutes I counted every vehicle that crossed the lawn. 1, 3, 5, 7, 10. 10 different drivers in half an hour. When I finished, I looked down at the number written on the page and felt something inside me shift. Because at that moment the problem finally became clear. I wasn't dealing with traffic. I wasn't dealing with accidents. I wasn't even dealing with rude drivers. I was dealing with a group of strangers who had collectively decided that my boundaries only mattered when they were convenient. And sitting there watching another vehicle bounce across grass I'd spent years caring for, I realized something else. If people refused to respect the boundary they could see, maybe it was time to create one they couldn't. The plan that formed in my head over the next few days wasn't dramatic, and honestly, that's probably why it worked so well. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want somebody's car damaged. I didn't want police reports, insurance claims, angry confrontations, or viral neighborhood Facebook arguments. What I wanted was much simpler than that. I wanted people to feel the boundary they had been ignoring. That's it. Nothing more. The funny thing about entitlement is that it usually survives as long as it stays comfortable. The moment inconvenience enters the picture, entitlement suddenly becomes a lot less attractive. Once I understood that, the solution practically designed itself. That Saturday morning, I drove nearly 40 minutes to a construction supply yard outside Grayson County. I bought several reinforced steel posts and a few other materials I needed. The guy helping load everything into my truck looked at the order sheet and asked, "You building a fence?" I smiled and said, "Something like that." On the drive home, I kept thinking about how ridiculous the whole situation had become. 6 months earlier, I would have laughed if someone told me I'd spend my weekend engineering a defense system for a patch of grass. But that's the thing about boundaries. Most people don't realize how important they are until somebody starts erasing them. By noon, I was outside measuring the exact route drivers had created through my property. The dirt path was so clearly defined by then that it almost looked official. That's what bothered me the most. Not the damage itself. The assumption behind it. Every tire mark represented somebody making the same decision. Somebody seeing private property and deciding their convenience mattered more. As I worked, my neighbor Carl wandered over carrying a soda. "You finally doing something about it?" he asked. "Yep. Need help. Maybe later." He stared at the path for a few seconds. "You know what's funny?" "What?" "If you'd done this the first week, people would have thought you were overreacting." "Probably. Now if you don't do something, people think you're a pushover." I laughed because he wasn't wrong. Communities have a strange way of normalizing bad behavior if it continues long enough. Eventually, the violation becomes routine and the response becomes controversial. I spent the afternoon digging a narrow trench directly beneath the route everyone used. The work was exhausting. The Kansas heat felt like it was coming from every direction at once. By the end of the day, my shirt was soaked, my shoulders hurt, and my hands looked like I'd spent the weekend wrestling a lawnmower. But with every foot of trench I completed, I felt a little more control returning. There was something satisfying about taking action after months of frustration. Not angry action. Deliberate action. The kind that doesn't require yelling because the result eventually speaks for itself. The next step took even longer. One by one I positioned the steel posts beneath the surface, anchoring them securely and checking every measurement twice. The goal wasn't to create a hazard. The goal was to create certainty for me and uncertainty for everyone else. Once everything was installed, I carefully filled the trench, packed the soil, spread fresh topsoil, and laid new sod across the entire area. By Sunday evening, the lawn looked better than it had in months. You couldn't see a single sign that anything had changed. Megan stepped outside carrying 2 glasses of lemonade and stared at the corner. "That's it?" she asked. "That's it. No fence." "Nope. No giant rocks. Nope. She looked back toward the intersection. I feel like I'm missing something. So will they. For the first time in weeks, I actually slept well that night. Not because I knew the plan would work. Because regardless of the outcome, I had finally stopped feeling helpless. Monday morning arrived faster than I expected. Around 7 o'clock, I was standing behind the living room curtains with a coffee mug in my hand. Megan sat on the couch beside me. You realize normal people don't do this, right? She said. Probably. We're literally spying on traffic. Scientific observation. She rolled her eyes. Then we both looked toward the intersection as the first car approached. It happened almost exactly the way I imagined. A dark gray sedan came around the corner and immediately drifted toward the lawn. No hesitation. No caution. Just pure confidence. The driver had probably used the shortcut dozens of times. He rolled off the pavement and onto the grass. Then he stopped. Not suddenly. Not violently. Just stopped. The confidence vanished instantly. The vehicle crept forward another foot, paused, then reversed back onto the road. Megan started laughing so hard she nearly spilled her coffee. No way. Yep. The light changed. Traffic moved. The sedan merged back into line. A few minutes later, another vehicle tried. Same result. Then another. Same result. By the fourth attempt, something fascinating started happening. Drivers were no longer reacting to the lawn. They were reacting to other drivers. Human beings watch each other constantly, especially when uncertainty enters the equation. Once a few vehicles backed away, everyone behind them became cautious too. A white pickup approached the corner, slowed dramatically, then stayed on the pavement. An SUV edged forward, stopped halfway, and reversed. By Tuesday, the entire atmosphere had changed. The shortcut still existed physically, but psychologically it was already dying. People no longer viewed it as guaranteed. They viewed it as questionable. And once doubt entered the picture, the behavior started collapsing. Wednesday afternoon brought my favorite moment. I was mowing the lawn when a man in business attire parked nearby and walked over. He looked annoyed before he even opened his mouth. What did you put under there? He asked. I shut off the mower. Underwear. He pointed toward the grass. Come on. You know exactly what I'm talking about. I pretended to think about it. Topsoil. His expression tightened. No. Whatever's stopping people. I shrugged. Private property. For a second, he looked genuinely offended. Then he said something that perfectly explained the entire situation. People have been using that route for months. I nodded. And, well, he stopped. Because he knew how ridiculous the argument sounded the moment it left his mouth. Using something for months doesn't make it yours. But somewhere along the way, he and dozens of others had convinced themselves otherwise. Eventually, he shook his head and walked away. I watched him leave and realized something important. The confrontation wasn't really about the shortcut. It was about expectation. People become surprisingly attached to privileges they never earned. Remove those privileges, and suddenly they act like something valuable was stolen from them. By the end of the week, almost nobody attempted the shortcut anymore. The dirt trail started disappearing beneath new grass. The intersection returned to normal. Cars lined up where they were supposed to. The constant frustration I'd carried for months began fading away. But what happened next was even more interesting than the shortcut disappearing, because once the behavior stopped, the rumors started. And those rumors ended up teaching me something unexpected about how communities react when someone finally decides to enforce a boundary everyone else had gotten comfortable ignoring. What happened over the next few weeks was honestly more satisfying than I ever expected. Not because people got angry, not because anyone got embarrassed, but because the shortcut simply disappeared. The behavior that had felt impossible to stop vanished almost overnight. Every morning, I would sit on the porch with coffee and watch traffic stack up at the intersection. The same drivers were still there. The same cars. The same rush hour frustration. The only difference was that now they stayed on the road where they belonged. Little by little, the lawn began healing. New grass pushed through the damaged patches. The dirt trail started fading. Areas that had been flattened for months slowly recovered until you could barely tell anything had happened. One evening, Allison and I were sitting outside watching the sprinklers run when she looked toward the corner and smiled. It's coming back. I knew exactly what she meant. She wasn't just talking about the grass. She was talking about the feeling that our property actually belonged to us again. For months there had been this low-level irritation hanging over the house. Every time a vehicle crossed the lawn, it felt like a reminder that strangers had decided their convenience mattered more than our rights. Now that feeling was gone. The funny part was that the rumors started almost immediately. Nobody knew exactly what had changed, but everyone knew something had. One neighbor was convinced I'd buried giant concrete blocks. Another swore I had installed steel beams. Someone else claimed I'd poured an underground retaining wall across the entire corner. Every version of the story became more dramatic than the last. I never corrected anyone. Honestly, I enjoyed listening to the theories. One afternoon I was mowing when a man pulled over and walked across the yard. I recognized him immediately. He was one of the drivers who had used the shortcut regularly. "Okay," he said, looking at the grass. "I've got to ask, what did you put under there?" I shut off the mower and leaned against the handle. "Why?" He laughed. "Because nobody can get through anymore." Sounds like the problem solved itself. He shook his head. "Come on, seriously." I smiled. "Seriously, it's private property." For a moment, he just stood there. Then something interesting happened. Instead of arguing, he laughed. Not an angry laugh. More like the laugh of someone realizing he'd lost a game he didn't know he was playing. "Fair enough," he said before walking back to his truck. After he left, I thought about that conversation for a long time. Because for the first time since this whole thing started, somebody acknowledged the reality of the situation. Not that the shortcut was gone. Not that traffic was inconvenient. The reality that it had never belonged to them in the first place. A few weeks later, my neighbor Russell stopped by again. We were standing near the corner looking at the restored lawn when he said something that stuck with me. "You know, people are talking about what you did." I laughed. "I'm sure they are. What's funny is nobody talks about driving across your yard anymore." "What do you mean?" He pointed toward the intersection. "The thing that should have been controversial became normal. Then when you stopped it, that became the controversial part." I stood there thinking about that. Because he was right. Somehow dozens of people using private property as a public road had become acceptable. But enforcing the boundary suddenly became the topic of debate. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how often that happens. People get comfortable crossing lines. Then when someone finally pushes back, they act shocked that the line existed in the first place. Looking back now, I don't think this story was ever really about a lawn. The grass was just the visible part. The real issue was respect. Respect for property. Respect for boundaries. Respect for the simple idea that just because something is easy to take doesn't mean you're entitled to it. I never yelled at anyone. Never threatened anyone. Never damaged a single vehicle. All I did was make it harder for people to ignore a boundary they had spent months pretending wasn't there. And once ignoring it stopped being easy, almost everyone suddenly remembered how to follow the rules. To this day, the corner still looks great. Most people driving through Fairview Crossing have no idea there was ever a dirt road cutting across that lawn. The shortcut is gone. The grass is healthy. Life moved on. But every now and then, when I watch cars waiting patiently at the light, I can't help smiling a little. Because the solution was never about blocking the path. It was about reminding people that some lines exist for a reason. Now I want to hear what you think. Was I justified in creating an invisible barrier beneath my property? Or should I have handled the situation differently? If dozens of strangers were driving across your yard every week, would you have done the same thing, built a fence, called the police, or simply let it go? Let me know in the comments because stories like this always spark strong opinions, and honestly, that's what makes these conversations interesting. Sometimes the line between protecting your rights and overreacting depends entirely on who's standing on which side of the lawn.